Hi, everybody. I'm Zeke Torres, and thanks for continuing to be interested in Git. In this segment, we are going to actually initialize a repository. So there are two ways that I prefer to do that. One of them is via GitHub, and then we initialize the repository there, and then we can clone it down to our local machine via GitHub Desktop. Or the other way is if we do it on GitHub Desktop, and then we push it up to GitHub and start to manage it there. So let's look at the first way where we're going to use GitHub. So remember, in an earlier segment, I've advised you or suggested that you create your own account. I've already done that, so I'm assuming you have as well. I'm going to create a new repository. I'm going to give it a name, and this one's going to be called SAS Global Forum Example. And then I'm going to give it a description. And again, it shows that that's optional. Example of how to initiate a repo on GitHub. I just thought about it. Why don't we call this example 1, because we're going to have 2 examples. Now, there's a choice here between a public one and a private one. We're going to make this private. If you would have this as public, anybody who searched for that repository or searched your profile and found you could also find your repository and start to see what you're doing. So until you're familiar with what you're up to, and if you have any kind of team reasons or reasons for privacy over what you're doing, I would suggest you just pick private. And then there's a few other choices here. We're going to go over some of them later, but let's talk about what they are real quick. A README file is initiated and created. It just leaves a readme.md in your repository at the main level so that you can use that as a documentation page. Now that's pretty handy. I like it, and it does do it inside of the markdown language or the markdown syntax. So you'll see a readme.md, and you can begin to edit it in a text editor and start to describe your project. And it's really easy to learn that syntax and get familiar with it. It's very nice and simple, and it allows for some clean documentation. Then you have a .gitignore and a license. We're going to talk about the .gitignore more a little later in another segment, and the licenses, if we had any type of additional licensing keys for the type of software that we're working with. But the gitignore is meant to allow us to customize or inform Git in that repository, in that Git database, what types of files with wildcarding or with naming, specific naming, we want to ignore, so that Git does not include it in our repository, so that it's not kept or managed in our repository. That may be for any number of reasons, but one quick way to explain an important reason is we don't want to put data that is meant to be confidential or that has privacy restrictions or contractual restrictions from our clients inside of a Git repository. Not because Git can't handle it, but because it could be very tricky to later remove that data. And so we may be violating some type of contractual clauses or maybe some privacy clauses for patients. So an example that I give people is we might want to .gitignore files that have patient IDs in it, client IDs in it, patients' addresses, patient zip codes. Any kind of file or thing of that nature doesn't typically belong in Git. It would be very rare. So Git is meant to be a version control management system for our code, our syntax, objects that relate to our production of something. It is not meant to be a repository for data. Now, there are some people who use Git in that methodology, and there are very specific use case scenarios for that. So it's not impossible to use it for data, but it's not meant to be used for data. And one of the reasons, another reason is the performance and scalability of Git. Git is meant to track code changes, and it does it very nicely because it keeps in its own way a before and after picture of things. So if we were to do that with data, the way that data changes so often, it could become very excessive, and the bloat, the huge immense size of a Git repository could grow simply because the data changes so much that Git can't keep up efficiently. So we want to ignore and we want to exclude data from our Git repository, not code or syntax. So that's a differentiator there. We will do that later. So we're going to create the repository. And so now we have our repository initiated, it is created, but it is only on the web. It is on GitHub. This is basically telling me the main folder that I have in my Git repository, in my GitHub account. And this would be tantamount to a subfolder, which is a repository, but each one of my repositories is individually or separately kept and separately managed. You can kind of see them all here. So it's going to switch over. You can see my GitHub account, my GitHub repositories. So let's go back to that SAS Global Forum example. Here's that README and that markdown file, and you can start to see that I can edit it using this button. I can come in and start to create more lines to it. I won't just yet. I want to highlight and give you an orientation as to what you're seeing here. So let's go back. So now we can see a few other choices. There's issues, and that's if I want to open up kind of tickets to start to track changes that need to happen, and I can start to take actions. I can start to associate this with projects. I can actually create a wiki that belongs to this repository, and that's really nice if you want to start to document even more. The difference between the README in this specific location of the repository under the main branch versus a wiki is that the wiki sits with the repository at this level here in GitHub or in Bitbucket. However, the README file will get cloned down if I clone the repository. And we're going to clone that in a second so I can show you. But remember, this segment is about initializing the repository. So the other thing is that there's security in this location. I can start to manage what type of restrictions or other elements that I want to consider in terms of the management of the repository. In Insights, I can start to see who the contributors are, who the people are that are participating with my repository, and what kind of traffic or kind of usage the repository is getting. And that's nice if it's a public one, or even if it's an internal one, you can start to see that. And under settings, you can actually manage who has access to this. Well, I'm going to get back to that in a second. But what that allows me to do is to actually go ahead and pick which users can start to work on which pieces of the repository. I can create what the default branches are and what other branches I want to protect with certain rules or certain definitions of things. So that I would consider would be on the advanced side, and for a different presentation, a different topic, this is really meant to just give an orientation. So we're going to clone this in a second in the next segment, but this is the box where we can actually pick up the pieces that we need to connect this to our desktop, GitHub desktop, and actually pull it down into our local, machine, whether it's a desktop or a laptop, to start to work on it. So the other part to mention on this is we have branches. Branches are going to be explained in a next segment, but the main branch at this point is meant to be the branch that is protected. And what I mean by that is another rule. Now that we've initiated this repository on GitHub or Bitbucket, and it is the new repository, what we want to do is start to follow a rule that we will never make changes, typing changes or code changes or documentation changes right on the main branch. Now, I know that doesn't make sense yet, but I just want to put what the rule is out there. I can, for every practical reason, start to type and make changes here. But I don't want to, because I want a bureaucratic reason. I want a reason that enables me to track the changes that I make to the main branch separately. The way that we will do that is by creating another branch. Nothing is stopping me from working right on the main branch and making changes and seeing the change history that is involved in that main branch. But by working on a separate branch first, I can manage those changes and then merge them to the main branch. So we're going to talk about that process shortly. But again, one of the rules that I recommend is that we don't work or make changes on the main branch. They should come from merges from a subsequent branch. All right, so that is one way to initiate a repository. Let's look at the other way, which is with GitHub Desktop. So I'm going to open up GitHub Desktop, and I am going to go ahead and create a new repository. Now you'll see this looks a lot like the actual GitHub window and choices. So I'm going to call this SAS Global Forum Example 2. And I'm going to give it another description, example of initializing and so I'm going to be putting that inside of a different location because now I can choose the path where I would want it. So I'm going to go ahead and just pick some location here. And now this folder name can actually be a different one from the folder that I'm actually initializing as a name for the repository. So now I can select that folder and I'm going to go ahead and I can initialize with the README, which I want to. And here's that git ignore again, and then that license again. So again, we're going to talk about git ignore later, and the license really doesn't come up for this type of introduction to Git. So I'm going to create the repository. And now GitHub Desktop changes its look. It's starting to show me a few different panels that used to have some chatter, some information from another repository that already existed. But on this one, it's brand new. So there are no changes to really speak of, except look, the README was created. So Git has tracked that as a change, right? And you notice that in the other GitHub repository where the README was there. So that's the same type of initiation that GitHub has done for us, or the repository with Git has done for us via the GitHub Desktop. Now, I like to explain that GitHub Desktop and SourceTree are basically Git navigators. They help us navigate to the folder where our repository is at. And so here you can see the actual repository as a .git that is hidden. And this folder and all of its new subfolders below will be what Git tracks. So remember in a previous segment, we talked about how you needed to identify where you wanted to initialize your Git repository. I like to initialize Git repositories again via GitHub and then clone them down, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it's also just as easy to use GitHub Desktop, create the repository, and then push it up into our GitHub account on the cloud. So having done that, we're going to actually look at some ways to actually start to add things in there. But look at this. This is where the main branch is. Again, this is similar to that other navigation window that GitHub gives us. And then we can publish our repository. So on GitHub, we use this to actually clone our repository down. But on GitHub Desktop, we use this to push our code or our repository up. And this is because, again, GitHub is where we are centrally keeping the copy, the main copy of our repository. Our laptop is where we keep our local copy or our cloned copy. When we make changes on our laptop, they're not synced up until we actually push them to our GitHub account. And when we make changes on GitHub, which we shouldn't, remember there's a rule that we shouldn't do that. When we make changes there, when somebody else makes changes via pushes and pulls, we now need to sync that up and actually pull those changes down into our laptop, into our local repository. So we're going to talk about that cycles in a second, but that is the initialization of a Git repository. But now let's sync them up. So if you'll notice here, on my GitHub account, there is no repository at all for the one that I created locally. My GitHub Desktop, the SaaS Global Forum example 2 is not present. It's not there. So let's go ahead and using the push or the publication of this repository, let's push it up in there. And let's make sure this window is asking me where do I want to push this or put or locate this. Do I want to give it a specific name once it gets to that GitHub account? If I were part of a team and there was the specific type of team account, it might be an enterprise account, I would use that panel. Again, this is for an introduction to Git, so we're not going to go into those choices. It's reinforcing or validating and verifying that I want to keep this code private. That's that privacy choice that we saw before. And there is no organization that I'm concerned with this. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just publish this. If I was part of a team or if I was part of multiple teams, I could pick where this would go. So that would enable kind of an overarching umbrella of privacy or inclusion or exclusions by other teams. So there's no organization that this belongs to. I'm going to go ahead and publish the repository. And what it's doing is it's actually connecting to GitHub. And let's double check that there aren't any issues, nothing to speak of right now. Now that the connection's been made, you'll see that this has changed. It's no longer requiring a publish type of choice. It's asking more if I want to fetch or recapture, refresh the image or the repository from my GitHub account. So let's look at my GitHub account. This should change in a second here. Let's refresh that. There we go, 52. There's my SAS Global Forum example 2. It's private, and if we go into it, that is the repository now located on GitHub Desktop. So remember, in that example 2, what we did is we initialized it locally on my laptop using GitHub Desktop, and we pushed it to GitHub. We have that other repository where we initialized it on GitHub, but we haven't located it or cloned it down to my laptop. So let's do that. Let's take this and let's open it with GitHub Desktop. It's a great little choice. So we go ahead and open it. And I'm using a Chrome browser, so you can go ahead and find which choices are going to be applicable to your browser. Now it's basically saying via GitHub Desktop, I see a command to clone a repository. Here it's coming from a URL that was fed by that choice, and it's asking me to confirm that this is a repository that I do want to clone, and it's then asking me to confirm where I want to situate that folder in my list of folders that I have for my Git work. So for simplicity's reasons, I'm going to go ahead and keep it as a peer to this SAS Global Forum example 2. They're going to be kind of right next to each other. And remember, you don't want to put this repository that we're cloning inside of here because it's going to cause all sorts of issues. So we're going to go ahead and select that, and we're going to go ahead and clone that. And now GitHub Desktop has cloned those. And remember, I called GitHub Desktop and source tree Git navigators. So I can actually go ahead and click Show in Explorer. And now I can see that Explorer show me the .git that is hidden, which is the repository itself. There's that SAS Global Forum example 1. And then I can come into SAS Global Forum example 2. So again, it is both of those done 2 different ways, but we end up with basically the same results. And on GitHub Desktop, I can quickly navigate to any number of repositories that I have where GitHub Desktop is actually helping me track them. All right, so that is how you initialize a repository. Any number of ways there for you to try that. Go ahead and give those a try. And in the next session, we're going to start to talk about what branches are so we can start to put our work in there and move things along so we can see how this is going to help us for the code that we're working on.